Good day, everybody. Randy Franklin Smith here, answering the tough question, who has access to what? If you don't already have slides, check out the link right there, or I'm also going to send them out via the chat window right now to everybody. So one way or the other, there are the slides for you. Today's webinar is made possible by Dell and Alexi. Thanks for being with us today and making this real training for free possible.
My pleasure, Randy. It's always fun to have those webinars with you.
So here's what we're going to look at. First of all, what are the drivers for the question that comes up of how do you figure out who has access to what? And then what we're going to do is discuss what you have to understand technically to answer that question for Active Directory and SQL Server, SharePoint, and NTFS file permissions. Then we'll talk about how to answer that question. And I've got some really cool PowerShell scripts to help you with that. And then we'll say, you know what, after you go through all of the pain of answering this question, of doing an assessment, of really documenting who has access to what, you'll never want to do this again if you've had to do this manually. And so what can you do to avoid doing that in the future? But then we're going to show you, as always, how to take this way beyond PowerShell scripts and once and for all truly solve the problem of being able to instantly, say who has access to what. What does this group have access to across the whole network, using a really cool solution to be announced today by Dell. So lots of good stuff planned. Drivers. I think you guys know what we're talking about here. The things that come up that make us have to go through this process is, for instance, we have a resource, we have a file share or something else, a SQL database, and the question comes up, do we need this anymore? Is anybody using it? Or we are trying to get business owners more involved in deciding who has access to certain resources. So we've got a resource and we're wondering, well, who should be the one to govern access to this? This is an important resource and we want to make sure access control is correct. So who has access to this resource? And of course, compliance drives all kinds of things today. Lexi and I were talking about group cleanup too. It's pretty common to come into an AD environment and we've got all these groups, and a lot of them have nearly duplicate names and nearly duplicate memberships, right? HR reps, human resources. What's the difference between these groups? Can we combine them? So a group cleanup effort. Re-verification of entitlements, job changes, all of these things are the drivers for trying to figure out what does this group have access to throughout the environment. Lexi?
I think it makes a lot of sense, actually. So I think that you open up like a can of worms here. So I talk to customers, and especially regarding the group cleanup, everybody has that problem. Like a large enough organization has that problem. So 10 gigabyte database is not unusual these days. So, and why it happens? Well, because as we know, people come and go, and sometimes we do not really do a good job cleaning up all the, let's say, group memberships and groups that they used while they were with the company. And it seems like this is just, gets worse over the years. So your Active Directory database keeps growing, and there is more and more unused group memberships or groups that needs to be cleaned up. So that's definitely, a huge problem as I hear about it. And also you said that verification of access, I agree that it's a major driver too. So we all know that there are identity and access management tools, and they do a great job provisioning access according to the business rules, but they have limited context. How do you know that the group that they provision in the end is not used for something else? So without appropriate tools, it's just impossible to answer that question. Would you agree, Randy?
Yeah, those are good thoughts. And we want to let you know, folks, that you can share in the discussion too. Please use the question feature for anything that you want to share. It doesn't have to be a question. Any thoughts you've got, please put them in via question and answer, and I'll try to work them into today's discussion. All right, well, let's start with Active Directory. What do you have to understand from a technical point of view in order to really assess who has access to what? Now, in Active Directory, we're primarily talking about privileged access or administrative authority. So who has authority to reset passwords? Who can create user accounts? Who can change members of groups? That's what we're talking about, first of all, in Active Directory. And, of course, it all comes down to the permissions in Active Directory. The types of objects we're dealing with are user accounts, groups, organizational units, and group policy objects. The actions that we're talking about is, well, I mean, it is a directory, so who can view this data? But Active Directory is pretty wide open when it comes to view access by default, and most organizations don't change that. So it comes down more to who can modify or administer these objects, who can change a user account, a group, or a group policy object, or who can affect how that group policy object is applied. And then the other thing is who can modify the permissions on those objects. So that in itself, that's a meta permission, the modified permission. But that's, of course, very powerful because that means now that we can grant other people access to these objects in AD. Well, we certainly don't want to go and look at every single object and its access control list, and that, of course, is not how we should be controlling permissions either. So as we look at all of these different areas, Active Directory, NTFS, SQL Server, there is some type of inheritance. And the way the inheritance works in Active Directory is it starts at the root of the domain, and it flows down through organizational units and containers. Container objects are just like OUs. The only difference is you can't attach group policy objects to them. So like the built-in and the users folders in Active Directory right off the root of the domain, those are containers. But they do have permissions. So they do you know, have their place in the inheritance structure of AD permissions. Let's see here. Got something from Robert. He says, I understand the focus here is AD and Windows systems, but if we were asking an enterprise question, what about other operating systems and other file systems and authentication and authorization account stores like LDAP, Radius, and so on? Well, we'll get to that. So hold on, Robert. So let's see here. Now, inheritance can be blocked at any point. So you can go to any organizational unit or even a leaf object like a user account, and you can block inherited permissions from flowing down to that object. Now, the bad news is you're kind of blind to that from the parent level. So if we look at a given organizational unit that maybe has several levels of OUs beneath it, the parent OU is not going to tell us that, hey, the permissions flow down nice and clean from me on down to child objects, with the exception of this one OU where permission inheritance is blocked. The only way to see that natively in Active Directory is to open up Active Directory users and computers and plod your way down through looking at each OU. Now, we are going to look at some PowerShell scripts for pulling this information out, and then even better, you're going to love what Alexei shows you afterwards. But that is where we are with the native interface. Also, anywhere along the way in Active Directory, you can add additional permissions. So we're not blocking permission inheritance, we're just adding additional allow or deny permissions that go into the cumulative analysis of entitlements on that object. And again, you don't see that from the parent container. And I wish that Active Directory user computers kind of gave you visual cues about that kind of stuff right out in the tree part of the interface, but they don't. One other thing that people wonder about sometimes is you will find permissions defined directly on an object, even when you create the object fresh. So let's say we create a new user account. If you go look at the permissions on that user account, there's going to be permissions that are not inherited, but at the same time, you did not put those permissions on there? After all, you just created the user account, so where did they come from? Well, in Active Directory, each class of object has default permissions defined in the schema of Active Directory. And so then whenever you create an object of that class, it automatically just pops those permissions right there on that object. So that helps explain what you see there. Now, in each one of these environments also, we have groups. In Active Directory, it's very simple. We only have Active Directory groups. I wish it were that way, Alexi, everywhere else. I wish we just, all we had were Active Directory groups instead of, you get to SharePoint, you have SharePoint groups, you get to SQL Server, you have SQL roles, and that makes it even more difficult to track entitlements across your organization. Thoughts on that or anything else, Alexi?
Absolutely. Well, as you can see on this slide, Active Directory is probably the most sophisticated permission model. So it's really flexible, and I like the concept of those local, global, and universal groups. So, but it also can be used in the wrong way. So you might end up having too many groups in the Active Directory, and that can raise a problem known as token bloat, right? So I don't remember when, since when that's been a problem. Do you remember, Randy? Is it like the initial design of Active Directory, like Windows 2000?
Yeah, but it really happens, especially when you start merging domains and start using SID history,
Right. So the problem is that the Kerberos ticket size is limited, right? So, and there's a portion of that ticket which holds all those SIDs, known as a token. So the more groups you have, the more groups a user is a member of, the longer that portion of the ticket will be. So, but it's limited. So you might end up having too many groups, and then some of them will not fit. So, and that might lead to access deny issues, or just opening up access to resources that users shouldn't have access to. So it's a problem, and I guess the recommendation, as we will see, would be to keep that in Active Directory, but still control how many groups you will end up having, right?
Indeed. So that's how Active Directory works. Now, we'll come back to Active Directory and show you some ways to start at the tip of the domain and work your way down in order to see, all the entitlements for a given user or group. But let's talk about NTFS next. So in NTFS, permissions control just access to files. Really, files are the only real object in NTFS. We've got folders, but folders are like OUs and AD, right? So whereas AD has many different types of leaf objects, users, groups, computers, group policy objects, etc. File system NTFS just has files. It's all about the files. And the actions are what you're familiar with. I mean, this is what all of us have worked with for the longest period of time. And that is the file system. So, it's obvious. It's read, write, delete, modify data, and then, of course, always modify permissions. And inheritance works very similar to Active Directory. In this case, it starts at the root of the volume, like C:\\, and the permissions flow down from that point. Now, again, at any point, you can block permissions. Again, you don't see it at the parent level, and at any point you can add more permissions that are then factored in cumulatively to the other inherited permissions on that object. Now, we have the same groups available to us from Active Directory, domain, local, global, universal groups, but if this is a Windows file server, a member server that is a non-domain controller, we also have machine local groups. And so this is the first kind of group I don't like and I disapprove of. So let me point that out right here. We do not like machine local groups because as soon as you start controlling access with local groups on some member server, you lose your visibility of those entitlements up in Active Directory. So it's bad enough the way permission assignments are scattered everywhere. But at least if we follow best practice and only use Active Directory groups for entitlements, and then if we can keep track of what entitlements does this AD group have, why then we can fully assess what a user has access to without leaving Active Directory. It's simply a matter of taking that user, looking at the groups they belong to, and then what are the entitlements for each one of those groups. But as soon as you start using local groups on different member servers, now you've got to go to every single member server and look inside of every group to see if that user is a member for every server in the domain. And so, and you've got to do that for every user you ever have a question about. So, I mean, it's just totally impractical. Alexi, what are your thoughts on group nesting?
I think it's one of the complications that we have to deal with. So I think that it really makes sense to keep your groups centralized in a single location in Active Directory. It makes it so much easier to report an access and to manage that. But it sounds like, you know, there's a reality where you can't really delegate access completely to Active Directory groups, right? So you really need to have some level of group nesting on your local file servers as well. So, and we actually have a poll on that topic. So, Randy, do you think it's a good time to bring it up right now?
Yeah, let's do that. I've launched it.
So yeah, if you could just quickly pick one of the options, like to help us understand how extensively you use group nesting to control access to your files, folders, and shares. So that would really be a good insight, and we could use that data to. Yep, Randy.
No, I was just going to say, while that poll is going up, I want to answer a question from Robert. He says, are NTFS groups the same as or taken from AD groups, or are they distinct and different? Do I have two completely different sets of groups? And so when you're on a NTFS volume and you want to grant permissions, you can either use groups from AD or from the local computer. And let's see, right now, I'm not really presenting, right, because we got this poll open. So I'll show you what I'm talking about in a second. Robert, but the bottom line is you can use groups from AD, and those are just AD groups. They're not copied or whatever, but it's more the point that if it is a member server, you also have those local groups inside of computer management. And then, of course, you can have nesting between those groups. So you can take an AD group and make it a member of a local group on some member server. So that's what we're talking about there, Robert. I'll show you the two different places that I'm talking about in a second. Let's see, where are we with this poll? Okay, it looks like voting is slowed down. We got 64% sharing, voting, and then let's share the results. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, so I mean, this is very representative, I think. So 60% of you use Active Directory groups, so which is good. As Randy said, this is a best practice. But we can also see that 37% of you use some sort of group nesting, so a combination of local groups and Active Directory groups, and even 20% of you use more than 2 levels of nesting. So it just kind of speaks for itself and says that you really can't, you know, keep everything in Active Directory, even though it is recommended. So, and that just introduces a level of complexity you have to deal with. So you really have to understand how your group membership and group nesting works, and what type of access it opens, you know, with that membership.
Indeed. So let's see here. Here is computer management, and you see where I am, Robert? I'm here under local users and groups. So since this is not a member, since it's not a domain controller, we have local groups available to us. Those local groups can have domain groups even as nested members. There's an example one right there. It's not showing up the name because I'm not currently connected to my domain, but that is in fact, this is the local administrators group. This is the domain admins group that's a member here. And so when you grant permissions to an NTFS volume, you see you can select, you can grant those permissions to either of these two locations, your local computer, or if I was connected to the domain would show up there too. So that's where you get your two different kinds of groups, AD groups and your local groups. Let's see here. Nasir asks, what is the difference and what is similar about groups and OUs and AD? When should you use one versus the other? Okay, Nasir, it's common for people to get confused, but groups and OUs are apples and oranges, if you will. They're not used interchangeably. So if groups are used for giving members of that group access to something. When we put a user in an OU, that does not give the user access to anything. Instead, that places the user under the authority of whoever has admin control of that OU. So if you take the analogy of compare user accounts to files on a file system, well, how do you control access to files? How do you organize files? You organize them in folders. All right, well, likewise with user accounts and any other object in AD, we organize them and we control access to them, administrative access to them, with organizational units. Hope that helps you, Nasir. Tommy says, what you're trying to say is that an OU is not a security principle. I don't know if I was trying to say that, Tommy, but it's a good point, as long as you understand what a security principle is. But you're right. A security principle is anybody who can act in Active Directory, who can be granted authority. You can't give an OU authority. I like somebody else's comment. OUs are nothing but organizational units. I like that. Okay. Cool. So let's see here. Let's move on now from NTFS. Let's talk about SharePoint. So with SharePoint, you're basically controlling access to documents and list items. And the actions that you can perform are things like view, modify, check in, check out. How does inheritance work in SharePoint? Well, your top-level object is the farm in SharePoint, but permissions don't start at that level. The next level down in a farm are site collections, and that's where your permissions begin, at the root of the site collection. And then those permissions flow down automatically via inheritance to sites and subsites, and then within sites you have libraries and lists. Within libraries and lists you have folders, and then finally you get down to the leaf objects, which in libraries are documents and in lists are items, just a record. Now we can block permission at any permission inheritance at any time, and then that means that that object now has its own distinct permissions. You don't have the ability to add permissions cumulatively the way we described with Active Directory and NTFS. So it's either you allow inheritance or there's no inheritance at all and you start over completely with a clean slate of permission assignments. Now, as far as groups, again, you've got your Active Directory groups, and I'll stick to my guns there that we should only be using Active Directory groups, but you also have something called SharePoint groups. And so these are groups defined in SharePoint itself, and they're only visible in SharePoint. They only exist within SharePoint, and they work like other, they work as the way you would expect groups to. But again, those group memberships with SharePoint groups are buried inside of SharePoint. You will only know about them if you go and look in SharePoint. So again, the more we can avoid using machine local groups on Windows servers and SharePoint groups in SharePoint, the better off we are for being able to have centralized visibility and control of our entitlements. But, like Alexi says, for so many people and for so many different reasons, some of them good, valid reasons, some of them not so valid, You end up, though, with people using SharePoint groups to control access. Let's see here. Now, SQL Server. In this case, the objects that we're controlling access to are databases. Within databases, we have tables, stored procedures, views, and lots of other objects. The type of actions we're talking about, most of the time we think primarily of tables. And the things that you can do on a table is select, that means to view data in the table. You can insert, meaning we create new records. We can delete records or rows. We can update rows. With a stored procedure, you can execute a view. With a stored procedure, you can execute the stored procedure. That's the big permission there. And the way the inheritance works is there are some server level, or we should really use the term instance, SQL instance level permissions, but most permissions start at the database level and flow down through schemas to finally your schema objects, which the main one is tables. And a lot of people aren't even familiar with what schemas are, but like DBO, that's your default normal schema. So schemas sit in between databases and tables. Kind of, and don't flame me on this because I am saying kind of, schemas are kind of like folders then to help break up a database into smaller pieces. Now, can you block permissions at any point? Yes, and again, it's no way to see that from the container. And of course, we can add more permissions as we go down. And again, you know, this is not very visible from upper levels. In terms of groups, we still have our good old AD groups, but the other thing that we have are SQL roles. So they're not called groups in SQL, they're called roles. But you can define roles at the server level or the database level. And again, it's the same kinds of issues with regard to, you know, the advantages of sticking with Active Directory level groups. But there's a lot of database developers out there and application vendors that require the use of SQL roles. So again, you can never get completely away from them. Alexi, here's a chance for you.
Yeah, while I was listening, an idea came to me that we're just talking about a few of our examples of how permissions can be used in what systems, like SQL, Active Directory, Windows file servers. Certainly, it does not, show you the entire world, right? So you can have like various third-party applications, and each of them can have its own entitlement system, as somebody pointed out in our chat. So, and really you have to track a combination of native permissions granted through the operating system and whatever other permissions which exist inside the application itself. Even looking into the Windows world, in addition to those 4 examples which we gave to you, there are like at least a couple dozens of others. So, for example, securable objects, as Microsoft defines them, can include registry keys, services, printers, others. There are plenty of objects that you need to look into to understand the whole picture.
Right. And I want to share a couple comments from Daryl here. He says, to me, it makes sense to always use domain groups. However, in a large enterprise, it is almost impossible to keep track of where that group was used without actively scanning local machines to see where a given AD group may have been used. That is the absolute truth. And that's why I made the point early on that after we go through the process of identifying all the entitlements of our groups across the whole network, you don't want to go through that process again. And there is no silver bullet, at least with native functionality. I think you're going to find the Dell thing to be pretty close to a silver bullet. But you're right, there's no way to know unless you keep track of it as you go along. It requires procedures and compliance with those procedures, and that's just how it is. But using local groups does not solve that for you, right? Just saying, well, we can't keep track of where these domain groups are used. Resorting to using local groups doesn't buy you anything. It just becomes even more difficult. Another thing Daryl said is we used to use Active Directory groups, but found in our case we have many domains. All right, so if you have a lot of domains, this is an interesting situation that he brings up. If you need to move a server from one domain to another, you need to identify everywhere that that group is used. But if I'm using local groups, now I just need to repopulate the local groups to get my permissions back. So that's interesting. If you've got a lot of domains and it's likely that you're going to move a server from one domain to another, why, in that case, they found it advantageous to have local groups. But I tell you, that is kind of the dog wagging the tail, because what we're finding, I think just about everybody is finding, that if they have a lot of domains, they typically wish that they only had one domain. And there's no advantage to have multiple domains within a forest. The only security boundary between domains comes when they're separated by forest boundaries. So that's why domain consolidation is such a big thing in Active Directory today. Let's see here. Robert says, a point worth making is that SharePoint is simply a prominent example of an application in an enterprise, just like the other applications in the enterprise, each of which may have its own identities, groups, and entitlements. Yeah, absolutely. But we're just trying to cover some of the applications that are most common that we see out there. Let's see here. Matt asks, what are your thoughts on setting an email distribution list to group type security for use within SharePoint for access control versus creating an identity security group in AD for the SharePoint access? You know what, I don't follow that whole question there, Matt. I'm going to have to ponder that one a little bit and come back to it. All right, so that's SQL Server. Now, how do we answer this question? How do we start out from scratch and say, all right, here's a group. I want to find out, what does this group have access to in Active Directory, SQL Server, SharePoint, and NTFS? Or maybe it's not a specific group. Maybe we just want to be able to see how permissions are defined beginning with AD. So namely, show me all of my non-inherited permissions. Wouldn't it be nice if we could start at the root of the domain and say, recurse all the way down through all the organizational units and just show me where permissions are changed or where inheritance is blocked. And so here's a way to do it. This is actually a PowerShell utility. I found it at TechNet, and they actually put a GUI front end on it. But let me show you what it does. See if we can bring it up here. Wrong window, sorry. So this is AD ACL Scanner. It's a free PowerShell script, believe it or not. And it allows you to select a domain, or you could select a particular OU. And then you can tell it, skip default permissions. And it goes without saying, don't show me inherited permissions, because we've left that unchecked. And we've said, hey, add a column to show me when inheritance is disabled. And so you run this, and you get a pretty nice little report. Where'd it go? Just let it run again. But what you're going to see, oh yeah, let's start with the root of the domain. We get a decent little report, yeah, there it is, where it shows us each OU, and it's going to highlight if inheritance is blocked with this column right here, inheritance disabled. Then here's the OU, and then here's all the permissions defined on that OU that have been defined directly on that OU. And it's going to filter out stuff that was inherited. It's going to filter out default permissions. And so you're really seeing just what you want to see. Now, of course, this is just one domain at a time, right? but this is way better than plinking through Active Directory, opening up the access control list of every single object and trying to make heads or tails and pick out what's actually changed. So there's a link to that little utility. It's right there. It's you can download it from Codeplex. If you want something similar that just is executable from the command line, why check out this from the script gallery at TechNet. It provides much the same information, but in a more command line format. So I think you guys will like that. Oh, what permissions are required to run the scan? Tommy, you only need read access, and any user account has read access by default in Active Directory. So you don't need a lot of permissions. And that answers your question too, Paul. You don't need to run that as a domain admin. You just basically any user account should be able to run that. You just need to be able to run PowerShell. So that's AD. Got that one handled for you. Oh, Ralph says, what kind of load will these tools put on the system when it's executed? It's, I don't know, it's PowerShell and it's running some LDAP queries. I don't think it's going to, oh, well, someone else is asking that too. I don't think this is going to kill you, but I certainly haven't done any benchmarking on it. But again, it's just some LDAP queries that you're running. Now here's NTFS. This is another PowerShell command, and I've actually, it's so short that I pasted in the full text for it. Now, there's two pieces of information you need to fill in. What it's going to do is if you fill in up here, can't get my there, now my mouse is showing up. If you fill in a user or group name up here for the security principal variable, then what it's going to do is it's just going to dump out all the explicit permissions for that user or that group starting here. And of course, we're saying the root of the C drive. So what are we going to get with this copy of the script? We're going to get any permissions granted directly to Chris on the C drive, starting at the root and working its way all the way down. But we could change that to a group if we wanted to, if we're trying to figure out, what is everything this group has access to. Of course, we're going to have to run this on every volume of every server in our domain, but I'm getting you way closer than trying to do this via Explorer, right? What if you just leave this blank, just left it as two empty quotes? Then what you're going to do is get a map of all the explicit permissions for the C drive from that point all the way down. And you can get a copy here at that web address. Okay, let's see here. Somebody's asking about the links. The links are available in the slides, and if you look in your chat window, there's a link to the slides. Also, you should have a link to the slides in your email inbox. For SharePoint, I found a couple scripts there. I'm not as crazy about what I came up with at that point, but it's at least something to get you started. With SQL Server, I've got 3 nice scripts for you here. These are not PowerShell scripts. These are just transact SQL scripts. And so you're going to need metadata view capabilities with SQL Server here, not really SQL admin authority, but you will need a certain level of view authority. And this is going to dump out all of the explicitly defined permissions at the server level, at the database level, and then at the object level. And we get some really nice output with that. I just want to show you real quick what it looks like because I was pretty happy with it. So here, what we're seeing is that the hackers group, see, it's a Windows group, the name is hackers, and it was granted insert, select, take ownership, and so on to this database that we ran it on. And also, we're seeing that for the public group as well. So this works quite well. And this is the command for getting this information on a given database. The other one is going to tell us for each object. And so this is showing us the permissions that have been explicitly defined for this particular table, table 1. And so I was pretty happy with what I came up with for you on those scripts. Now again, you're going to need to be running the script on every single database of every single server you've got, but that's the way it is. So you can see how much work it is to figure out who has access to what throughout your whole environment. And we've only covered, 4 areas. There's plenty of other applications out there besides this. So what are some rules you can follow so you don't have to do this again in the future? Here are the 3 big rules. Number 1, assign permissions to groups. Never assign permissions to users. Now I hope you're all rolling your eyes with that, because you should be. Everybody should know this and should be following rule number 1. But rule number 2 is only use AD groups. Don't use SQL roles, SharePoint groups, Windows local groups. Now, a lot of you, including Alexi, have brought up reasons why you can't always follow rule number 2. But if you follow rule 1, 2, and 3, and then 3 is always document permission assignments on the group in AD. Now, are we relying on the operator? Yes, we are. But the rule has to be whenever we assign permissions on a group, we go to that group in AD into its comments or description field and put that information in there. Is it possible that it's out of date or incorrect? Yeah, it is. But I mean, this is the environment in which we live. If you want something better than what I've shown you, then I think you'll be interested in what Alexi shows you next, because figuring out everything that a user group has access to is laborious. You don't want to repeat it if you have to, if you can avoid it. So you got to follow those rules. But most of you don't even have time to go through this process and run these scripts on every instance of SQL Server and SharePoint and everything out there even one time. And you can't really depend on everyone in every application and server to follow the number 3 rule, right? So I think you'll like to see what Dell has to offer. And with that, I'm going to make you the presenter, Alexi.
Thank you, Randy. All right, so I think that was a great introduction to the problem area. So I think that now we understand why it is difficult to answer that question, who has access to what. And this was the reason why we actually built Enterprise Reporter. So I am very excited to announce that this is the date when we're actually launching that product. So later today, it will be available on the website. So, and I just wanted to give you a quick demo of that product, and so that you can understand how that question can be answered with a better technology in place. So before that, I want to just give you a quick introduction. So Enterprise Reporter, just so that you understand, is not only the tool for reporting who has access to what. This is actually just one of the pillars which the product was built on. So we call it security assessment, a much bigger problem to embrace. So it's not just understanding who has access to what, but it's also doing all sorts of activities and processes and checks to make sure that your security is in a good shape, that you have a good security posture. So it's not only like understanding how permissions are configured and how they are used maybe, but also understanding your local security policies, analyzing your group policies, and anything else that can influence the state of security on your system. Anything that is driven by the configuration of your Active Directory, Windows file servers, SQL servers, and so on. Also, right next to it is a configuration visibility. So Enterprise Reporter gives you visibility into other configurational aspects, not just permissions. So you might want to know what is the software that is installed in your servers. Does it match the list of the corporate approved software? So what are your local users and groups? So what databases you even have in your SQL Server? So all those questions can be answered as well. And somebody brought up during this session that domain consolidation is a big topic these days, and this is actually the reason why you have to have, you should have sometimes local groups. For that particular case, Enterprise Reporter can provide all the pre-migration assessments. So basically understanding how many groups users you have, how they are structured across the OUs, what users should be migrated first, what dependencies you might run into. So all of that is covered in the pre-migration bucket, which we also provided with this tool. And Randy showed you very good tools, which are free, of course, and that you can use to quickly analyze permissions in different servers. But I guess the main question is, how do you do that on the enterprise level? How do you manage hundreds or even thousands of servers, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of users and groups? How do you do that? Well, something tells me that those scripts might not work in that environment. So, and that's why you really have to come up with a balanced and scalable architecture to embrace that scale. So, and with Enterprise Reporter, we have everything in place. So you can see here, this is the rough architectural slide, very high level. But the key here is that Enterprise Reporter uses a distributed architecture. So it has the agents that can be installed on either computers themselves or on some other servers and scan your file systems remotely. And we also have a concept of clusters and nodes. So that gives you the ultimate scalability and the workload distribution in real time. So you can really scale that product horizontally to embrace your entire organization. And I can tell you that we tested that product with large corporations which have hundreds of thousands of users groups and tens of thousands of servers. So now, let me share some secret sauce from Dell. So we might figure that that whole big question, who has access to what, really comes down to two main questions. Where this specific user or group has access. So this is a kind of a user-centric view. And also, who has access to this particular resource. So this is a resource-centric view. So the secret sauce here is that each view requires different architecture and different approach. For user-centric view, actually, I kind of swapped those two in this slide, so it's a mistake, but bear with me here. So for user-centric view, you actually are interested in live permission queries. So you want to know, on this particular time, what and where user have permissions. So you don't want to wait until all the data will be collected, because you might have again, thousands of servers, and to wait for that data to come up can be just unacceptable. For resource-centric view, on the other hand, you know what resource you are talking about. You know that it can be like a file server or a NetApp device. So that's why you can effectively target your collection, and the reporting on pre-collected data makes more sense. So user-centric view requires agents. That's the only way to actually answer that question quickly, while for resource-centric view, it can be agentless, of course. So, and another distinction here is that difference is that for user-centric view, you might be interested in explicit permissions, right? Just like Randy showed with those utilities, you might not be interested in all the inherited or default permissions, just everything that was granted explicitly. While for the resource-centric, you are talking about effective permissions, which factor in all the variables like inheritance, group membership, and so on. So, and with that, I want to give you a product demo. So one demo is really worth 1,000 of slides. So let me just quickly switch to my demo environment and step you through the product. So Enterprise Reporter has two user interfaces. One of them is used for administering the collection processes. And I want to just quickly show you here why it can scale out so well. So you can see here that we have two main parts in it. We call it discovery management. So this is to embrace that resource-centric view and collect all the data required for that. So the concept here is that you have clusters, and clusters made of nodes. And nodes can be engaged at any point of time based on their availability. So think about that as clusters represent your geographical locations. You might have 3 geographical locations. Each of them will have its own cluster, and within those clusters, they will have more than one node, which provides for both load balancing and high availability. So for the user-centric view, on the other hand, we have agents, as I said, and agents can be local or remote. So if your servers are sensitive and nothing can be deployed on them, you can get by with the remote agents, of course. But we recommend local agents for better performance and real-time insight into your permissions. So you can see here that I have 4 agents deployed right now for 4 different computers. So now let's see how we can analyze the data that is collected with the Enterprise Reporter agents and nodes. Again, there are 2 ways to do that. You can either use one of the reports, which we provide you out of the box, and I just pulled, what is it, 7, 8, 9 reports to just to pay attention to, but there is a lot more, like more than 100. So reports work against the pre-collected data. So I will start with a report on Active Directory permissions. So Active Directory permissions, as I mentioned, is probably the most complicated and sophisticated model. So there are many variables that have to be factored in here. So think about like actual organizational units where permissions are applied, object types, permission types, and of course how those permissions to what users or groups they are granted. So you see here that for each of those variables, we actually have filters. Filters are dynamic, meaning that they really work with the data that's already collected. So for example, you can say that, show me a list of all the OUs. So you can pull it up, click search, and see all the OUs here that you can just drag and drop to this box. So, but one of the questions that I see our customers ask is basically a relation between OUs and groups, and that question was asked again during this demo. So it's a best practice in most of companies to make sure that groups granting access to particular objects within a particular OU should reside in that OU. So the same applies to users. So how can you find, for example, violations or from this rule? So this is how we do this with this report. You see here that I selected the organizational unit as my target. So basically, I will be reporting on permissions for this OU. And I also said that I'm interested in all permissions assigned to all users and groups located outside of this OU. So it says exclude accounts located in this OU, right? It's kind of inverse logic. So if you run that report and see how quickly it comes up. So it will be like, several pages worth, and it will show me all permissions in a very nicely formatted way, applied to all the groups and users down to a particular ACE, and again, kind of permissions violating my best practice. So for each of them, I can see whether or not it's inherited or not, and it again comes up pretty quickly because the data is pre-collected already. So moving on, another example would be the folder permissions. So this one reports on folder permissions in your files, folders, and so on. So again, for each of the variables which we talked about, we have filters. They are quick and they are dynamic. They are based on the data that's already collected. One thing I want to emphasize here is group membership. So we concluded that in some cases you cannot get away without it. So, and we really have to factor that in. So for that purpose, we can actually expand the group membership in line, kind of in the report, and let you know what users get access to particular files, folders through that group. So let me just pick an option, expand inline, excluding members of the main users group, because this is like the group that contains every single user in your Active Directory. So when I run the report, and you see how quickly it comes up again, you will see that it's built as the data comes in, so you can start analyzing that right away. And that report shows me all permissions granted either through direct assignments to groups and users or through group memberships. So you can see here the inline expansion, for example, the domain admins group, and it's all a nested group membership because one group can contain the other, and we show all that expansion right in the report. So speaking of file permissions, so imagine how many files you might have, like millions or even like more than that, right? So basically, how do you effectively narrow it down to those files that you are only interested in? So here's an example how. We can effectively filter by, again, any variable, and one of those could be the file wildcards or file extensions. So in this particular case, I'm only looking on files located on this server with a HTM extension. So once I run the report, it comes up very quickly, and again, I can see that permissions granted to all my HTM files located in my IIS directory, and again, down to a particular user and access right. So one other thing to emphasize here is that you can certainly report on explicit permissions and inherited permissions, and any combination of those. So this is how we actually report on effective permissions, or permissions that are granted to a particular user considering all the variables and all the inputs. So, and this concludes the resource-centric view. So let me now show you how we can show permissions granted to particular users. So for that, we came up with a different UI, which is more interactive, more ad hoc, and that one uses live data that is currently located on your file servers. So let's say I want to analyze permissions of my user account. So once I double-click on that account, it brings up me a list of computers where permissions for that user were found, right? So, and permissions can be, again, direct permissions granted to the user account, which is not a best practice, but also permissions granted through group membership. If I click on any of those computers, it will actually bring me a set of groups through what that user was granted access. I can see the direct permissions granted to a particular user, or permissions granted to through a particular group. And again, it honors our nested group membership, not just the direct members, of course. If I click on the user account, it actually brings me a list of permissions granted to this particular user explicitly. So we can see that I don't have that many, like 100 of permissions granted on the particular server, which might be okay. So you can always go back, start your research again, go to that same server and say, I want to see the all accounts, permissions granted through all accounts. And that will build the list of all ACs and ACLs granted to that user through a group or directly. So I already built that query, and here is the full list of files. You can see that it's more than 15,000 objects. So how do you analyze it effectively? Of course, through filters. So you can say that, okay, I'm not really interested in all of that. What I'm looking for is everything that happens to be on this file share. So, and it's one of critical moment to emphasize here is that when we're talking about file permissions and folder permissions, we really have to consider permissions granted on a share itself, because this is kind of the first level of defense. If you don't have a permission to share object, you will not even go deeper and will not even get access to the folders. So here in this single view, you can actually see permissions granted to a share and to a folder, side by side, kind of one after another. So, and it tells me that my user has permissions both to share, both directly and through domain admins group, and to the underlying folders. And you can see all those permissions here in the bottom part of the UI. So now, let me show you another cool use case. We talked about that it's really hard to make sure that groups that is provisioned for a particular purpose, for example, the SAP users group, does not have access anywhere else. So how do you know that? How do you know that that group is not abused? So this is how. You just select that group in the view, and you can analyze permissions granted to the group. So let's say that PMMM is my SAP server. So it's kind of expected to have permissions for that group on that server. To double check that it's okay, I'm going to that server, I'm going to that group, and I'm seeing a list of permissions granted to that group. Let's just clear the filter here. You see that permissions are granted to the SAP directory, and they kind of represent the SAP data, so it's okay to have that group mentioned in that directory. So, but what about other files? Files located on other servers. So I can see here PMDC2, which is most likely my domain controller. So let me see what permissions that group has on that DC. As you step through it, you will see that actually this group was granted a permission on ntds.did file, which represents my Active Directory database. Moreover, this group has a full control permission, which opens up a huge security hole you might not even know about. So going back, Another example, permissions on my PM mail, which is my Exchange server. If I step through it, I will see that my group happens to be a very powerful security principal granted permissions on my Exchange folder. So you can see that it has full control on my V14 Exchange folder, which represents my Exchange data. So again, this is just a quick and easy way to access permissions for a user and group and make sure that they meet your security policy and go in line with the provisioning rules enforced by your identity and access management systems. So that concludes my demo, and I wanted to wrap it up with some information on where you can actually get this product. So as I mentioned, Enterprise Reporter, its key benefit is that it brings you that 360-degree view of user and resource permissions, both in a user and resource-centric view. And you can count on Enterprise Reporter to accomplish a lot of things around security. You can tighten up your security. You can clean up your Active Directory by analyzing those groups that are not used. You can pass compliance audits, and you can certainly offload your IT staff to make sure that they can focus on more high priority business projects. Enterprise Reporter, again, as I mentioned, is more than just a permission reporting tool. So you can see it for yourself. Just click on one of those links. We go live today. So hopefully later in the afternoon, those links will open up. So feel free to download the product and give it a try. It's a free 30-day trial. So now back to Randy.
Thanks a lot. And we got some great questions both for you and me, Alexei. Let's see here. Let's start with just a comment from Paul. He says, my view is local groups is not good for central administration. Having local groups is too big of overhead, but we've got other people, equally saying we have to use them for various reasons. One thing that people bring up is, I'm just a lowly server admin. I don't have domain admin authority and Active Directory. But that's one thing we can solve, and that is by delegating authority, where we give you an OU for you to create and manage groups. Let's see here. And we've got a few questions about how this product, Dell Enterprise Reporter, relates to other Quest products. Do you want to take a look at those in the Q&A window? Alexei, I'm talking about Mitchell and Tommy and Mark. You want to take a look at those and get back with us with how you'd characterize that?
Yeah, sure. I think I saw those questions. So one question was how this relates to Security Explorer, so another product that originally came from ScriptLogic and became a part of Dell. So ScriptLogic is more of a management tool. So if you want to quickly fix right on the spot your permissions, like back them up and restore them and apply changes in a bulk, this is the perfect tool to use. So Enterprise Reporter is more of the reporting tool and data exploration tool. The good thing is that those two tools are integrated, so you can basically have Security Explorer connect to Enterprise Reporter, retrieve its data for about user permissions, and then you can use advanced management capabilities of Security Explorer to fix those permissions right away. So that is kind of integration that exists. Another question was, does Enterprise Reporter replace Quest Reporter? Well, it's a very good question. So actually, those of you who had a chance to work with Quest Reporter might find some similarities between those two. Yes, we are actually going to swap existing Reporter customers to Enterprise Reporter customers, but of course, we will give you enough time to do that, and Enterprise Reporter will be the go-forward product. So.
Yeah, I think you got them. Let's see here. Robert asked me, what do you recommend for break glass rescue on servers and desktops versus a local admin group? Well, most people rely on the local admin user account for break glass, and some shops kind of have one password for the local admin account on member servers of a certain class. Other folks try to go full best practice and have a unique local admin password for every single system, and then of course they have to keep that in some kind of break glass location. So I don't know if that really answers your question, Robert, but if you can elucidate on that, while I'll try again. Let's see here. So Matt is saying, Matt is the one that brought up the question about email groups. Joseph says, I think he means unifying identity groups as both a distribution list and a security group. And then Matt is saying, so do not use email distribution lists for SharePoint security. So I think maybe maybe I'm learning something new here. Matt and Joseph, are you saying you can use Active Directory distribution lists as groups to grant permissions in SharePoint? Is that what you're saying? I've never thought of trying that. I've never read that you could, but that's interesting if you can. So they're going to get back to me. Oh, they say yes, you can. Interesting. That's a whole new one on me. Did you know that, Alexa? You can, you know, a distribution group, like you can't use that on NTFS permissions, but apparently you can go into Active Directory and use a distribution group to give somebody access to a site collection or something.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I saw customers use that. It provides better manageability and like less risk. So you can't use those groups for anything else. So yeah, I agree. I got a couple of questions, like product related. If you let me answer those.
Go for it.
So one of the questions was, can you report by share folder? Yes, you can. I think I showed it that we can actually have those two in a combined view, together. The other one was, what protocols, methods, and ports do agents use for communication with their centralized reporting service? Well, it's a proprietary protocol. It's a firewall friendly. You can open up that port on your firewall so that the agents can communicate effectively. As far as the integration with the file systems themselves, we certainly use the lower level API that lets us subscribe to file changes, especially permission changes, and update our permission index, making that reporting really quick for the user view. So I also had a question, can Enterprise Reporter drill down into the registry and services ACLs? Yes, it can. So out of the box, we have reports for pretty much all of the main Windows objects, including registry keys and services. So where in the domain, which server it is best to install this product on? It is usually better to install it on a separate server, just because it requires some CPU. If you plan to use your distributed collection architecture with nodes and collectors, that kind of simplifies and lowers requirements for that server, because you can use the CPU power of remote servers. But if not, make sure that it will be performant enough to take care of all the collections. User-based access review in all of the agents-based attached resources. Yes, basically you have to cover your entire environment with agents, and that limits the scope of your analysis in the user-based view. Okay, I've covered that one.
What about Rosemary's question from a while back? Can this product be used in a VM environment?
Certainly it can, yes. It doesn't really matter where your software servers are hosted, on a physical box or on a virtual machine. We support it all. If that question is about can you report on permissions within your virtual infrastructure, this is something I would like to follow up with you on, if you don't mind. So I'd like to understand like what exactly is being asked here. Does Dell Enterprise Reporter support NetApp as file server? Yes, it does. We support not only NetApp, we support EMC, we support Dell FluidFS. So basically, pretty much most popular network filers. We support them through remote agents that can scan it remotely, and we certainly can collect the data in the database for the resource view based reporting. Is there a plan to integrate Access Manager with Enterprise Reporter? Well, I'm glad that people know so much about Dell products. Access Manager is another product which we have. So we are going through the consolidation right now. So basically, Enterprise Reporter has some of the functionality of Access Manager, as you might have seen. So, and that's kind of an ongoing effort. Other server sizing guidelines available in the documentation? Yes, you can check it out. So we do recommend certain hardware configurations to, but it will certainly depend on how many servers you have, how many files on each server, what the response time that you would like to get from this product, like how long you can wait for reports to come. So there are many variables for that. What about Change Auditor? Which one is preferred? Well, again, I'm happy that you know about other products. Change Auditor is all about auditing changes, right? So it doesn't give you the state-based reporting. In fact, it's highly recommended that you have both. So you have the Enterprise Reporter to give you like an insight into your current state or historical state of permissions and your configuration, and you ought to have Change Auditor to track changes in between, so, and react to those changes. So that's the major difference. One does not replace the other. They actually provide a better together story.
You know, on that, what about Jorge's question about, is there a permission comparison report to show what has changed as far as permissions?
Yes, there is. You can basically, since you are collecting data, let's say like daily or weekly, you can certainly collect or build a report on what was changed between those two collections, or, you know, selected collections. I'm sorry, I'm gonna.
Daryl's question.
Daryl's question.
It's a long one. 11 o'clock is when it came in.
Can you ask that question? I'm sorry, I kind of.
He says, can this tool, for instance, show nested group structure of how a user gets their access?
Yeah. I saw the question now, Randy. Thank you. So yes, certainly. This is actually one of the major features. So I think I showed that during the demo. You can see like the group membership structure, and you see what groups the user is a member of. And of course, it's recursive. It's not just direct members. It honors all the group membership and nesting, starting in Active Directory and going all the way to the local groups as well.
A number of people are asking about integration with active roles, yet another product.
Yeah, right. Well, ActiveRole Server is a brilliant product that kind of enforces business rules in Active Directory and other systems as well. So we do have plans to integrate with that product. So if you would like to speak up to me about that, like what exactly you would like to see, let me know in the survey maybe. I will reach out to you and we will see what we can do in the future versions. But certainly that's been asked a lot, and it really makes sense.
You got a couple questions about architecture, like Robert wants to know, how do the agents communicate with the central reporting servers in terms of, you know, protocol or ports? Maybe he's thinking about straddling, you know, firewalls or something. And Hugo would like to know, how do you update local agent versions? Do you have to do it one by one, go to that system locally, or can you push out changes?
Okay, good question. So I want to tackle the second one first. We do have the completely automated agent management system, so it's centralized. You go to the configuration manager, you see a list of your agents, you can track the status of those agents, see the version, and if you want to, if the next version comes out, you certainly can select all of those agents and update them from a centralized location. So speaking of ports, I think I covered that already, but basically we use the proprietary protocol and a proprietary port. You can open it up on a firewall to make sure that the communication will pass between the agents and the servers. Yet another vote for integration with ActiveRole Server, specifically to push specific reports into the entitlements area for the ARS Web UI. Exactly. Yes. Thank you for speaking up.
David asks, can you report by share or folder?
Yeah, yes you can. So you can limit the scope of your report or the scope of your collection to a particular report. And you can see permissions granted to a user both to a share and a folder in a single view, which really makes sense because they kind of influence one another.
I like Mark's question. I think he brings up something important. He says, we've talked about NTFS, AD, SQL, and so on. He says, but does it do things like vCenter permissions, exchange permissions, third-party products? And that, to me, is the big challenge for you in this space, is to support pulling permissions from as many different systems as possible, and it just takes time to do that, obviously.
Totally agree. So I just want to say that Enterprise Reporter is a modular product, so and going forward we'll keep adding modules for different kinds of systems. So, and certainly Exchange is on the list, vCenter as well. So yes, we do have plans for those. Right now I just wanted to cover like the 80% of mostly used applications, and that it certainly includes Active Directory, file servers, NetApp filers, SQL servers, but we will be adding more modules down the road. Another good question from Prince, is this similar to or different from an identity and access management solution? Well, I think it's complementary. I think I kind of made the point that identity and access management systems, they enforce business rules within the applications, within the Active Directory itself, but they kind of have a limited context. So on the other, you can report on permissions granted through those business roles. So how do you make sure that the same group which was used by identity access management system does not have permissions anywhere else outside of that application? So this is the tool to use. It's more kind of admin-centric tool for both security and day-to-day operations use cases.
Just to circle back about the question about distribution list groups in SharePoint, Robert says the problem is delegation of admin authority to distribution list owner, and David notes that using distribution lists allows member management via Outlook. So this is a totally new concept for me. I'm willing to admit the whole thing of distribution lists in SharePoint. So I have to give some thought to that and talk about it in the future. But that's why I love how interactive we make these events, Alexi. We get a lot of synergy from all the people that attend.
Absolutely, and thanks for providing that feedback, everyone.
Jamie asks, or Jaime, what is the I/O hit on clients running the agent? Is it recommended to have a secondary enterprise reporter server local to the clients collecting data to be pushed to the central server?
Well, the server is like a single instance, right? You don't have to have many servers. It's the nodes and agents we're talking about. So the node is a kind of remote collector, and you can have as many nodes as you want to cover your entire network. What's critical is that nodes should be as close to the actual data as possible, because it will certainly optimize your data collection times and network traffic exchange as well.
That makes sense. Licensing, it's not based on agent, it's probably based on number of enabled users, or what?
Yeah, it is based on the number of enabled users. So this is kind of consistent with other products we have here at Dell.
All right, great. Well, I think we're at the end of our questions, and thanks a lot for all your comments and questions, people, and thanks for spending time with us. We hope that this was useful to you. I hope you can use these scripts, and I hope you also take a look at Enterprise Reporter. You've done a really nice job with it, Alexi.
Oh, thank you very much, Randy, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on this webinar. Thank you, everyone.
All right, have a good day, everybody. We'll talk to you again soon.